Welcome back, everybody, to me rambling about something general. Yes, this is not a video on the Wheel of Time. Don't worry, those continue. I'm already 60% through that book, Towers of Midnight, and I'll record the respective video later tonight. But this is something generic that I want to talk about for a bit here. Yeah, that's basically what I wanted to say on the matter. So, yeah, it's a generic thing. It may have minimal spoilers for both Book of the New Sun and the Malaz Book of the Fallen, but I'll try to not do actual spoilers. So just in case, I want to look at something today about how we read fantasy, how fantasy has changed, and how that may be a problem. And I'd very much welcome your opinions in the comments on that. If you're new here, welcome! I'm Raf. I talk about books mostly and other stuff, and I'd very much appreciate you subscribing, liking, and all of these things if you actually enjoy or want to hate watch. I'm fine with both, really. So that's what we're going to do today, and it's time to give a cheers to another person that is supporting me on Patreon, because that's sort of what those people get, an extra cheers. This one goes out to my brother John in Canada, who's been very kind to support me, and you've seen him in some of the videos. Good man. John, this one's for you. Cheers, brother. So yeah, if you feel you want to make me drink a beer and cheer you in a video, consider joining the Patreon, but there's no obligations there. You can still get every single video and everything here. That's not how the Patreon works for me. I don't want to, keep stuff locked away from you. Alright, now let's look at what I really want to talk about. And I'll tell you a story and then I'll try to make something out of it. So while trying to actually go through a ton of unread emails, which is what I should do right now, and hopefully will return to, distracted myself by having some booktube videos in the background, something I do far too little because, I'm busy with all kinds of stuff. And I watched some of the Critical Dragon videos, and there was one on Warrens and how to read Malaz, and it goes in all kinds of directions. You should definitely go and read, watch it. It's a good video, but I took something away from it that rang like something like within me, and I've kind of connected it to something that has annoyed me of late in other situations, and I'll try to make a whole thing out of it. So what do I mean? What I mean is the following. AP said that fantasy fiction has over the last years, turned towards more like magic systems, and yeah, fuck the system, right? But and things like that, and that makes maybe understanding some parts of Malazan a bit different from reading other fantasy fiction, and that may be true, but I want to go into a different direction with this, because I think it's a larger problem. It's a larger problem with fantasy fiction in particular. I guess the fantastic is sort of like the idea that I'm talking about here now. And that is having answers. Having definitive answers. And here's what I'll try to explain, right? There are stories, or like when we read books, when we watch movies, when we, there will always be questions that we want to have answered by the book, the movie, the TV show, by the narrative. I guess the easiest one is if you're reading crime fiction or like police procedural or whatever, you want to have like that most basic of all questions in that kind of format that you want to have answered is like, who's done it? Who done it, right? That's the question, and the read will be satisfying if at the end you know who has been the murderer. That's how that works. Now you can play around with that, and sometimes you explicitly leave it open rather than open-end and whatnot, but that is a question that if I pick up a police procedural or a detective novel, whatever you want to call it, crime fiction, I can reasonably expect that the author will, in this book, set up a mystery and then give me an answer. A definitive answer on that. That's how that works. And there's other books that do the same kind of thing. There's always like, these kind of stuff. In a romance novel, the answers that I can get definitively get are who's gonna be together with whom. That's who's, and it's the whole thing of Twilight is like, the question is like, who will Bella end up with? And the answer is obviously that creep vampire. As far as I know, I haven't actually read it. I only watched the first movie by accident. The point is, that's a question that you can reasonably ask of the narrative, and otherwise, and be disappointed or feel disappointed if that question is not answered by the end of the novel. There's also some of those for, say, fantasy stories, right? The Lord of the Rings answers some questions. One of them is, will Frodo manage to drop the ring in the volcano? The answer is, big spoiler, yes, he does. Will Aragorn become king? Those are questions within the plot, within the narrative that will be answered. And that's fine. Now we get to a problem, especially with fantasy books, especially with contemporary fantasy. And I blame gaming for it. Don't get me wrong, I love gaming. We're running a wonderful D&D campaign currently on the Discord server and everything. Not the point, but what happened when we switched from just consuming narratives that left all kinds of questions open, right? You read Lord of the Rings, and yes, there is considerable world building happening there. Plus, you have all those appendices and stuff where you get actually answers that go beyond the narrative, that answer questions of the world, like who was the 21st king of the Western Line, or whatever. Those kind of questions that you could possibly have, but can't actually expect a story to tell you, right? We learn who is the predecessor of Conan of Cimmeria on the throne of Aquilonia. But we don't know who that guy's predecessor was, or anything like that. We don't have a list of the Aquilonian kings. And the Conan stories don't need to provide that unless there is a situation about, that previous king and their descendants or whatever. But, and this is what I'm trying to go for, when we switched to role-playing games, especially once we started to talk about settings, worlds to play in, which is not exactly where it starts with a lot of, D&D, where you just have very specific contained adventures and stuff, and then later start building whole, setting worlds, like the world of Krynn for Dragonlance, or the world of the Forgotten Realms for all these atrocities that R.A. Salvatore has perpetrated over the last 30, 40 years. And there's more of those settings. But what we do there, and this is a very interesting aspect, because those worlds are fictional worlds that are marketed to readers that read those and then create something with it to build their own fictions in that fictional world. Similar to what you do with fanfic, I guess. Basically, those kind of things are role-playing games in that setting, like D&D on a published setting. Your adventures are basically improvised fanfic on the table. That's how it basically works. Now, the point is that these settings, those role-playing games, were specifically marketed to facilitate that, to make us go and create stories within that framework. And that kind of thing, that kind of setting, those kind of books, and, a setting book like the Forgotten Realms campaign setting or whatever you want to use, has to answer very specific other questions. It has to answer the question who were the 15 last kings of, I don't know, somewhere in the Forgotten Realms. Who's the current ruler of Waterdeep? Who was the ruler of Waterdeep before that and before that and before that? Why is everything in Kalimshan Orientalist bullshit? Well, it's not answering that question. It's just building it up. But you know what I mean. A setting that is a framework to build your own narratives within has to answer different questions that we as potential players and game masters need to have answered. Who's the mayor of that village? Where is that village? All these things that for a specific narrative are not necessarily, necessary. That's a bad word, you know what I mean? But so yeah, but in a campaign setting, those are necessary. But still, and this is the other important thing, those campaign settings are still sort of open, because a book is a very finite resource. A book has a page count. Everything that's in those pages is what you call canon. Everything beyond that, you, the player, need to invent. We, the players, need to invent. And that canon can be extended by adding more setting material and whatnot. You get your Menzo Berenzan box set, so you know all about like misogynist Orientalism underground and all of that. You get your Icewind Dale or whatever. Yeah, you get your Icewind Dale campaign setting, so you know all about those. Like, are they 9 towns? I keep forgetting that place. So you get all these bits and pieces added to answer more of those questions and give definitive answers to that. Answers that are no longer the answers of the player, but the answers of the official publisher. You establish an official canon and an official world with a lot of facts and definitive answers. And that's just like how the industry worked in that regard. And then we come to the next part there, and that's computer games. Computer games have an even stricter aspect to it, right? Computer games, by being, limiting interaction, and this has obviously changed over the last couple of years and decades, but especially in the beginning, or like once we added graphics and didn't just like have endless text adventures in Zork, but even there, have even less interaction or for the player. So what we get is everything that can fit on one floppy disk, one CD-ROM, one DVD, one Blu-ray. As I said, this has changed now with downloads and whatnot over the last couple of years, like decade or whatever, but in its framework, a single-player adventure game, a single-player computer game, has a limited amount, a finite amount of actions that possible actions that the player can take, and thus a very finite amount of answers and questions that can be answered and that the player can expect to have answered within that computer game. And that's all fine and dandy. But let's look at the other side of that, shall we? All right. The point is that with those kind of games, what we as players, dungeon masters, when we played like D&D or whatever, what we learned is that we have the expectation, and up to a point, the justified expectation that our questions will get a definitive answer. If I am running a campaign setting in Waterdeep, and there is that book about Waterdeep, that campaign setting, that box set, whatever. I can expect Wizards of the Coast, or back in the day, TSR. I have the reasonable, justified expectations that the authors and publishers of that campaign setting will answer my question, which is, who's the current Lords of Waterdeep? Who runs that tavern? I can, up to a point, expect answers for those questions that I could not actually expect from J.R.R. Tolkien. Tolkien had no responsibility to tell us the name of every innkeeper in Gondor, in Minas Tirith even. We don't have that we can't have that reasonable expectation of the author to give us those answers. The same goes for stuff like magic. Tolkien has no responsibility to tell us how magic works. The writers of a Dungeons and Dragons manual have that responsibility because they want me, the player, and the dungeon master to reproduce that and build that magic and use it. That's a different requirement. And my argument here is, there's like a larger societal argument behind it, of course, and I'll definitely drop that in a moment. My argument is that has certainly impacted, and depending on your opinion, or in this case my opinion, because this is my channel, also somewhat ruined both fantasy books and our expectations of fantasy books and the way we read fantasy books. Because after a while, we being mostly Western humanity, people started writing. The next generation of fantasy writers came up. Next generation of fantasy writers, with the whole idea of the tabletop role-playing games industry and all of these people behind it. And we obviously need to also include like Star Wars with all the fuckery that's connected to that, right? Where we suddenly sell a universe, we sell an intellectual property with a canon. We no longer just sell a story. So there is there's always the idea that you can sell world information in addition to just the story information, right? And people that grew up with that started to write their own fantasy worlds and started to tell their own stories in their fantasy worlds. Some of them explicitly, like, say, the Malazan world, that is a made-up fantasy world that obviously has, for people like Steven Erikson and Cam Esselman, right, very definitive answers on some of the questions that we as readers don't necessarily need. I don't need to know who's running which tavern in Daruzistan. All I need to know is who's running the Phoenix Inn. That's basically what I need to know for Garden to the Moon. But I'm pretty sure that Cam and Steven Erikson both know other tavern keepers in Daruzistan because their players or their adventures took them to other bars, and then on the spur of the moment, either someone came up with a name or you rolled in a table of random names in one of those wonderful name books that people had back in the 80s. Now you just use a random name generator around the internet. But those questions are not necessarily, are not necessary for me, the reader. But a lot of people, not everyone, but a lot of people that started writing stories in their imaginary worlds that they maybe built to first run adventures in, have a lot more information about that world than is actually needed for the story. Once again, Tolkien even had that, but the expectation wasn't there at the time, which is what I want to look at here, right? The point is, we come to a group of authors that not only have more information about the world in which they are telling a story, but they also have maybe the expectation to themselves, or have fans with the expectation that these questions, these additional informations about the world, that world building, needs to be available to the reader. And suddenly, we get a lot more definitive answers about a world. And my argument is that that is not necessarily good. And it's not good because of two reasons. First of all, it limits our imagination. If everything is answered about a world, my chance of interacting with the book, imagining, visualizing all kinds of things is limited. If I get a description of like how many stripes every gown has in the Wheel of Time's world, I can't imagine those differently. Now that can be a deliberate choice by the author because he has a very distinct idea of like how everything works, but sometimes it's just put in there because someone feels the need to add these details because, people are expecting these kind of details now through their, the visual element that computer games added to it, or, the way you have like tabletop role-playing supplements with all kinds of pictures and stuff. And visualization always limits imagination. That's just how it works. Because suddenly we have a picture, and that limits how we can imagine things in the future. So on the one hand, having a more precise and more detailed world building available to the reader has, can limit our own imagination, our own fantasy, and thus maybe make it harder for us to empathize with characters, visualize ourselves in those situations. That's certainly something where, skin color, ethnicity, and so forth plays a huge role. But it's not exactly where I want to go with it today. My point is that we as readers have become rather lazy and expect authors to provide all those questions. Suddenly we feel that Glenn Cook's Black Company has bad world building because we don't get any of those additional informations. And we feel cheated or feel that this is not good because we're expecting something different. And that's like the first side of it. The second part of it is that we expect that those answers exist. We sit there and we expect that there is a definitive answer how something works in the world, which is where I come back to the whole Warren's situation with the Malazan world and what AP started out with, right? We expect as readers, or we're tempted to expect how to have a final and definitive answer on how the magic in the Malazan world works, how Warrens work, how many Warrens there actually are. And if we don't get that, we feel kind of cheated. We either start complaining, say the magic system is broken, which is, dumb as fuck, but or we start looking somewhere else for these answers, which is where I'll end this, because I feel it's the last part, and it's certainly the part where we here on BookTube kind of play a role that can be a problem, or on, like, say, Reddit or whatever. Because what happens is we start discussing these questions with other people. On a Discord, we suddenly discuss how many Warrens are there. And this is where I see the big problem in the future. Because we want those definitive answers. We believe there are definitive answers. And if our authors, in this case Cam Esselmont and Stephen Erickson, remain silent on those so pressing questions on how many Warrens there actually are, and if there's, then we'll look for other authorities that may or may not give us the answer to that. And then we'll try to find out what makes those people authorities. And we're like, well, people with, academic titles, people with large numbers of subscribers, people with a special access to the specific, topic we're talking about, and so forth. And it's also tempting to say, well, if Cam and Steve haven't given us the answer, I'll just ask AP and see if our AP has the answer, because we know, and I'm not attacking AP Canavan here, and I'm just looking at a process that we as readers in general tend to, fall into, or can fall into if we're not careful here. Right? And once we have people that are, authorities on specific aspects, it's also easy to because we as humans, because we always believe there are definite answers, we're always happy for someone with an air of authority to provide those answers, right? We suddenly feel that maybe if we have other questions about a book, if we have other questions about another book, we might also get that definitive answer from someone who is already an authority on another, like, maybe vaguely similar, work of fiction, because we feel that those books are connected, and suddenly we have, like, well, we're looking for the definite answers on Book of the New Sun by AP Canavan, who is just another reader and nothing more. And this is where I want to end this for today. I think in our search and our need for definite answers on stuff that is not necessarily, like, tied or, actually tied to the narrative, that is not necessary to understand the narrative, to enjoy the narrative or the world, in our search to get those answers, we start to rely too much on authorities, and we are basically, like, making ourselves, us readers, smaller than we are, because we can take those books, and we can just go and read the hell out of them, and we can imagine all the things that are not clearly claimed there. We don't need the answer from someone else. If I read the Malazan Book of the Fallen, and I want another special Warren that just, like, feels like could be there, I can imagine that. I mean, I can't go and write fanfic about it. I mean, I guess I can, but know what I mean. But it's like, I have those freedoms. If I read the Book of the New Sun and I interpret a specific part of that book in a specific way, that is my bloody right. There is no... Books are infinite. Books are not finite with a finite number of definitive answers to every possible questions. That's not what they are. And if we feel that way, and if we fall into that trap, we're losing. We're losing out. We're losing a lot of like the wonderful things that books can give us, that reading can give us, the freedom to actually enter those worlds. And it goes also back to something AP said, like books can be a portal, when we talked about the portal fantasy stuff, right? We're losing. We're basically hobbling ourselves when we enter the world through that portal of the book. If we rely on others to tell us the definitive answers, whether those are the actual authors or people that we think or feel may know more about the world than we do. And this is where I want to end this, because every one of us, when we go out there and do booktube videos and ramble about stuff, including me, we run the danger that someone else watches our content and then takes what we say as gospel and figures that we have answered that question. And you know what? If I claim something and you feel that it is a good answer, then go ahead, but do that because it feels right for you and not because I said it. And that's basically where I want to end this for today. It was a very spontaneous idea, and I figured I'll do more of the spontaneous stuff in between. How I see that computer games, the Dungeons & Dragons, computer games, and the way they influence the fantasy genre have led to a place where we are not using our imagination anymore while reading books, but demand to be spoon-fed every single answer by the author or someone whom we give authority over that. Those can be the people that write companions, the companion to Westeros, the companions to the Wheel of Time, all of those books. Like, did those authors make up half of that? Yes, they did, for fuck's sake. We can make up our own stuff. As long as we're not licensing any product, any setting for our own, products. This is our own world, just as much as it is anyone else's world. And it's important to understand that. Anyway, that's it for now. I hope you enjoyed that. And once again, I want to make this clear. I have nothing but the highest respect for AP. I just picked him out because I see the problem there. I felt it was easy to point out that specific problem there. If it came across as an attack, AP, I'm really sorry. Otherwise, have a great day and see you around. Cheers.